Hello, my name is Tina Brestrup, Director of Student Services, and today we're going to be talking about Chapter 103, which pertains to physical confinement and restraint. And as we all know, sometimes in working with students, it is necessary to restrain or confine students. And so we just want to make sure that all of our students are safe and also that all of our staff are safe and protected. This is an annual requirement that we do training, so this may not be the last time you see this video. So please just try to sit back and enjoy. I'd like to start the training out today by sharing the SPEEDO-BIKINI rule, mostly just because it's one of my favorites. And this rule states, just because you can doesn't mean you should. But in a sense, it does pertain to seclusion and restraint because we need to be sure that we are using this only in instances when it is necessary, which I know all of our staff would address only in that manner. So I kind of share this rule to make it a little more lighthearted, but confinement and restraint is very serious, and we need to be very informed about when and how and the requirements around restraint. So with that, we'll go ahead and jump right in. Chapter 103 covers all of the items listed here on the screen and pertains to these topics, which we will go through individually. And again, the main areas are the seclusion and restraint and also physical confinement. And then what you need to do as far as documentation, notifying parents, and then also those prevention and intervention techniques, as well as talking about PBIS, our positive behavior interventions and supports, which are very important and essential as well. So this is kind of set up, if you recall, in kind of a multiple choice test format, and you'll see how great my test writing skills are here as we go through. So I'll just kind of go through these and then highlight the correct answers, and you can maybe just kind of be thinking to yourself ahead of time if you know the answer yourself. So Chapter 103 pertains to the Iowa administrative rules related to, and I kind of just gave you a hint on this one in the previous slide. And so hopefully as you think about that, you're thinking about all of the above. And the rules were amended in 2008. And so with that, take a look and see which of these you think would be the correct answer here. If you're thinking A, that would be correct. And that's why we're doing this training that we'll be doing annually. Again, just more on the topics and the subjects that we will be covering in this training. And again, all of the above. So now when we get into looking at the purpose of Chapter 103, is it to place limits on the physical contacts you have with students and raise your awareness that the force used must be reasonable, to give you guidance on physical restraint, or to give you guidance on the use of timeout? Again, it's all of the above. So you can see these first slides really just pertained to overall the training topics. Now we're going to get a little bit more into some of the definitions, and this is kind of a matching setup here. So as we look at the first definition on the right hand side, talking in a calm voice, adults moving in slow movements, offering choices, providing clear guidelines, removing stressors, and providing calming items or activities. That would be de-escalation techniques. Very important as you work with students. The second one, to question or obtain knowledge or intelligence gathered, or to gather useful information. That is what we call debriefing. And debriefing is very essential if you are involved in a seclusion or a time when you need to restrain a student. And if you have been involved in this, or when you do get involved with a student, when you need to use one of these techniques, you'll really understand more the importance of this. And when you're debriefing, some of the things you're talking about is what happened, do you understand why it happened, why did you do what you did, maybe what could have you done instead, what could you do the next time, and what would be helpful if there is a next time, And that's really the importance of debriefing. And then also sometimes it can be kind of emotional and upsetting to you, and so it's just a time for you to get support from your colleagues and just process through what happened. So I don't want to skim over the importance of that. The next definition, redirection, offering choices, timeout at the student's desk, and timeout in a location in the classroom. Those are all some other disciplinary options to seclusion and restraint, and the point there being that seclusion and restraint shouldn't be your first measure of intervention with students. And then the last one there, a lot of the schools will be very familiar with a broad range of systemic and individualized strategies for achieving important social and learning outcomes while preventing problem behavior. That's our PBIS, our positive behavior interventions and supports. So one more slide here with definitions. The first one on the top right, intentional physical punishment of a student, including the use of unreasonable or unnecessary physical force with the intent to harm or cause pain. That would be the corporal punishment, and as we all know, that's banned by law. So the middle one there, confinement of a student in a timeout room or some other enclosure, whether within or outside the classroom, from which the student's egress is restricted. That is the physical confinement and detention, sometimes called timeout. Egress, if you're not familiar with that word, just means you're blocking the students so they can't get out, or they're confined in an area. So for your bus drivers out there who are listening to this, this could be as simple as if you're standing, if the students are in their seat and you're standing in the aisle of the bus, kind of blocking them so they can't get out of their seat, that would be considered confinement. If you're kind of in an open stance where they can get up and walk out, not so much confinement. But if you're really standing it, blocking and not letting them out, that would be considered an instant of where you've confined the students, and then the documentation and the parent notification that I'm going to talk about later would apply. And then lastly, that last definition is just how they define physical restraint, and it's really about reducing or restricting the student's ability to move their arms, legs, or head. And of course, this does not include the temporary holding of a student when you're kind of supporting them with some of their daily living activities for students that have more significant cognitive needs. So maybe if you have hand over hand and you're helping them feed themselves or something like that, that obviously would not be considered physical restraint. So let's look at another multiple choice here. The use of seclusion and restraint shall be used as a discipline for minor infractions. It may be used regardless if other disciplinary techniques have been attempted, or it involves a period of time which shall be reasonable and necessary in duration. And that is the one that we're looking at. Of course, you don't want to use this for minor infractions, and you want to try other disciplinary techniques first. Now some true or false items that I want to jump into here, having to do with the restraints. So material restraints may not be used to confine or restrain students. That is true. Safety restraints, therapeutic or medical devices, if used as designed, may not be used to restrain or confine students. That is false. What this is basically saying is for some students who have some supported devices like maybe a chair with some straps that helps them sit up if they have some physical disabilities, obviously you can use that for them, but you would never use that with a student to kind of who didn't have the physical need, and you were just using that to confine them in the seat. No employee shall use prone restraint. Is that true? That's when you hold the student face down. Yes, that is true. Prone restraint basically is just very unsafe and unmanageable, and it can be and has been found to be a precipitating factor in the way you're positioning the student to cause them not to be able to breathe, and it has resulted in death for some children in the past. So you never want to hold them face down if you can avoid it. No employee shall use any restraint that obstructs a child's airway. It's kind of an obvious one. That's true. And if a child signs or uses another mode of communication, their hands are not required to be free to communicate. and that's false. So basically that's saying if they use sign language, if they have some device that they use, some sort of button device that they use to communicate, they need to be able to have their hands free, or however they typically would communicate with you free. And again, that's for safety, because if something's happening or they need to tell you something, they need to be able to communicate with you. What about this one? No employee is forbidden from using incidental, minor, or reasonable contact to maintain order and control. That's true. Whether force is reasonable depends on the facts of each case, considering 5 factors. So it really is individualized in each situation. So the five factors that would be considered if you would ever have to restrain or confine a student and someone was questioning whether that was reasonable or not, these are the factors that they would take into consideration. One would be the size, physical, mental, and psychological condition of the student. The nature of the behavior or misconduct, what are they doing? Does the response or consequence really match the severity of the behavior? What you use to apply force, was it just your hands doing some sort of typical restraint? The extent of the injury to the student, if any, and your motivation for using force. So they talk a lot about reasonableness with students, and this might just be a good point to share that staff that are in buildings who have some high-need students with behavioral needs, which might be more likely to need to be restrained or to put in time out. Staff in our district are trained in what we call CPI, and it's Crisis Prevention Intervention, and it really goes through the proper techniques for restraint and confinement, and really talks about the philosophy of that program being care, welfare, safety, and security. It talks about de-escalation and just how to respond to children appropriately. So if you're a staff member working in a building, you can't always anticipate when you might need to confine or restrain a student, but if that would happen a couple times and you need to be involved, and you anticipate it might happen again in the future, you might just want to be talking with myself or with your building principal to make sure that you get in on that training. That training does happen annually, and usually we do that at the end of the year, and there's annual recert as well. So just be aware of that, and also know that I'm proud to say as a district we are committed to that training for our staff. Here's another question. No employee is forbidden from using reasonable and necessary force not designed or intended to cause pain. Again, there, the intent is another thing they look at. And here are our choices. And again, we have an all of the above. Some fill in the blanks. A period of confinement and detention must be reasonable. We talked a little bit about that already. We need to give reasonable break for bodily needs, of course. Sleep does not count. And then this is really important too. There's a time period with which, if a student's been confined, you need to involve the administrator to get approval to continue to confine them, and just make sure you're looking at the conditions that are involved in that confinement and kind of have an administrator oversee that and say, yes, this may continue on. And that length of time is either 60 minutes or whatever a typical class period is, whichever one's shorter. So that's the time period you need to keep in mind. The room that the child's confined in, of course, must be reasonable as far as size, based on the child's age and size. Of course, needs to have sufficient light and adequate ventilation, and of course be in a comfortable temperature for our students. What about this one? You are prohibited from locking the door to the confinement area. What do you all think about this one? That is false. Keyed locks are absolutely prohibited, and that's based on state fire code interpretations from the Department of Public Safety. So you can never have a child in a room that has a keyed lock door on it. But you can have a locking mechanism, one of two kinds. The first one is a lock that is engaged by pressure, and that must be staffed at all times if that's the type of lock. And also you cannot disable that lock, so you can't put tape over that button you push in so it's automatically locked all the time. And of course, again, that's for safety. And the other type of lock you can have that we have in some of our newer buildings is a lock that automatically releases when one of the building alarms sounds. And that type of lock may be unstaffed. But regardless of the type of locking mechanism, when I say unstaffed, what I mean is there has to be an adequate and there always has to be adequate and continuous adult supervision. And the Iowa Department of Education has stated that they don't read that to mean non-stop line of sight view of the student at all times. What that means is that an adult needs to be within proximity of that seclusion room so that they can readily detect, the status of the student and be able to respond quickly if needed. Of course, the Department of Education would expect that you have periodic visual assessments of the students, looking at them through the window, etc., opening the door, checking on them. But again, that visual assessment of them does not need to be nonstop. So that's what you kind of need to know about locking the rooms. Now on to parent notification and documentation. If you use one of these approaches with a student, which of the following must occur? We must have parent notification. We have to document the incident. And the contents of the incident, which of these do you think are not important? When you're documenting what happened, do you think it's really not important at all? Do you think if it didn't quite go the way you wanted, maybe you should fabricate it a little bit and kind of add some extra or leave some items out to CYA? Or do you think that we have this all documented for you so you're sure not to miss any of the important things that need to be documented on a form in the district, a school stream form called physical restraint or physical confinement? Yep, that would be the one, of course. Which of these is true? Is this form only accessible by principals? Kind of already told you the answer to this one. Located in school stream forms? Completed only if someone is hurt? Or useful for decision making? The answer there is B and D. It is really useful for decision making because you're documenting such things as what happened before, what was happening during the incident, what happened after, how did everybody respond. And that can be helpful as you go through that debriefing process I talked about earlier in deciding how you might respond and what you might do differently next time. So it's very helpful documentation, not only to notify the parents, but also to use yourself in planning for the student. And there are some timelines of when parents need to be notified, which are not in this presentation, but they are on that school stream form. And it's very important that you meet those timelines if you're involved in this type of situation. Another thing that's really important is, the crisis prevention and the intervention and what we do with de-escalation. And as we know, anytime you can have a calm reaction or a more proactive approach is really going to improve the safety for all parties involved. So we want to make sure we're always giving clear guidelines. If the child has a behavior plan, we always want to make sure that we're following it. Otherwise, you want to use the de-escalation techniques that were referenced earlier on that matching slide, and any other de-escalation techniques that you're familiar with or that you obtained through the CPI training that we have. You want to always give students a more attractive alternative, an option, and always keep in mind, your safety and the child's safety. Prevention is really key as we look at this, and everything we do must be purposeful. This term, positive behavior interventions and supports, is not new to us in our district. We are very familiar with this concept. And again, it's really important that we use database decisions. We have a nice PBIS process similar to some districts will refer to it like they use it for academics, RTI, response to intervention, or MTSS, multi-tiered system of supports, are really going to help address how you can be proactive with these students and make sure you're using your system-wide approaches with students, and then for students who need more individualized supplemental or targeted intervention, that we follow that. So we know that, it's more likely if we have positive relationships and interactions that we're not going to need to use constraint and confinement. But again, this is just an important training topic that we need to include with this training as kind of outlined by the state. Of course, use positive stated expectations instead of negative. Define what the expectations are for meeting and also for not meeting, kind of showing the students what it looks like, and also non-examples as well. And then always looking at focusing on teaching acceptable replacement behaviors. And we know that there's a lot of research behind PBIS. And what does the research say? Does it say to utilize reactive approaches, focus only on student behavior, utilize data-based decisions, or teach and acknowledge behavioral expectations, or C and D? And C and D, those are the ones we're looking for. So that's the information that I just wanted to be able to share with you regarding Chapter 103 and the law and the requirements. Of course, if you have questions in the future, feel free to visit with special education teachers in your building, your AEA staff, your principals, and you can always call me as well. Please don't hesitate. And I hope you have a great year and have limited times when you need to use restraint and confinement with your students.